All right, so we're really diving deep into this nursing law stuff today. You weren't kidding with all this material. We've got Cozier and Murray over here, a stack of slides, even patient rights documents. This is serious.
Absolutely, and you're right, it's serious stuff. But it's not just about memorizing a bunch of legal jargon. It's about understanding how these laws, these ethical codes, all work together to keep patients safe.
Yeah.
To give you the confidence to make those split-second decisions.
Right, totally. So where do we even start unpacking all of this? Cozier, for example, talks about nurses having their own lane, their scope of practice. But what does that actually look like day to day?
It's like, okay, imagine a highway, right? Each car has its lane, right? You've got your lane, the ambulance has their lane. Scope of practice is kind of like that. Nurses knowing their lane, doing what they're educated and licensed to do. Ultimately, it protects you and the patient.
So no nurses performing, like emergency appendectomies on the side of the road?
Well, unless they're also a licensed surgeon in their other life, then maybe. Yeah. No, but seriously, that's a great way to think about it. Knowing your boundaries, practicing safely within them, that's key.
Okay, I get it. Boundaries are important. But what happens when those lines get a little blurry? Like your notes mention questioning a doctor's orders. That seems like, I don't know, a tightrope walk.
It's a core responsibility, actually.
Yeah.
If an order seems off, maybe the dosage is wrong or it contradicts a patient's allergies, you've got a duty to speak up. Not about second guessing, just advocating for your patient's safety. That's all.
Wow. So advocating for your patient, even if it means questioning another, medical professional, that's got to take some guts.
It does. It really highlights how vital clear communication is. Nurses are often that bridge between the patient, the doctor, everyone on the healthcare team.
Totally. Okay, speaking of things that could get legally complicated, let's talk legal terms. I'll be honest, my eyes kind of glazed over at tort law, negligence, malpractice, all that. Can we break this down?
Of course. Tort law, it sounds intimidating, but it's really just a fancy term for civil wrongs that cause harm to someone. So someone sues because of an injury or some damage, tort law is probably involved.
Okay, so it's kind of like the big umbrella term for a bunch of different legal issues. And then where do negligence and malpractice fall under that?
So negligence, think of it like messing up, but in a legal sense,
Mm-hmm.
Anyone can be negligent. You forget to look both ways before crossing the street. Boom, negligence. Malpractice is specific to professionals, though, like nurses. It basically means messing up on the job.
So malpractice is kind of like negligence, but with way higher stakes because it involves your professional duties.
Bingo. You got it.
Mm-hmm.
Malpractice means a professional, in this case a nurse, didn't meet the accepted standard of care and, the patient was harmed because of it. That's serious business.
Okay, that actually makes it a lot clearer. You mentioned standard of care. Is that where things like, forgetting to put the bed rail up or something would come in?
Exactly. Forgetting the bed rail, not documenting medication properly, even something as simple as, not washing your hands between patients. Those could all be seen as breaching the standard of care expected of a nurse. It all comes down to showing you are careful, like a reasonable, prudent nurse would be in that same situation.
Reasonable and prudent. Got it.
Yeah.
So documentation, all your materials emphasize that a lot. Why is that so important from a legal standpoint?
Think of your notes like they carry legal weight, right?
Yeah.
Each entry, it's like a potential piece of evidence if there's ever a court case. It's not just about you remembering what you did or didn't do. It's about being able to prove you are being reasonable, that you met the standards of your profession.
So every chart entry is like a potential legal document. Suddenly those late night charting sessions seem way more important.
Exactly. It's not just about covering yourself legally, though. It ensures the continuity of care, helps prevent medical errors, keeps everyone on the healthcare team in the loop.
Right. It's about the bigger picture, ensuring that patient is getting the best possible care. Yeah. Okay, so we've covered some, the basics, but what about situations where things aren't so black and white? The ethical dilemmas nurses face on the job.
That's where things get really interesting, right? Nursing isn't just about following the rules. It's about navigating those gray areas, using your judgment, that ethical compass you've been building.
Like that case study we came across, the one with the patient who had chest pain and the nurse didn't assess them right away. It's like a perfect example of how things can go wrong, even with the best intentions.
100%. It really highlights the difference between negligence and malpractice playing out in a real-world situation. But let's delve into that case study now.
So this case study, it involved a nurse who didn't fully assess a patient who was complaining of chest pain, and well, things kind of went downhill from there, right? So what's the big legal takeaway for nurses?
It circles right back to that reasonable and prudent standard we were talking about. Put yourself in the nurse's shoes for a sec. You've got a patient complaining of chest pain. Like, that's a huge red flag, right? Chest pain, that's got to be taken seriously right away.
Yeah, chest pain is nothing to mess around with. So in this case, the nurse not doing a complete assessment, that could be seen as, like, neglecting their duty, which could then lead to a malpractice lawsuit.
Exactly. And it's especially true if the patient gets worse because of that delay. That's where those legal terms, causation and harm, those come into play. Really drives home the point that even small oversights, they can have huge consequences.
It really makes you think about just how much critical thinking goes into, like, every single decision a nurse makes. It's not just about, checking boxes and following orders. It's about constantly assessing, analyzing, advocating for your patient's well-being.
Now you're getting it. And that whole idea of patient well-being, it brings us to another big piece of nursing law, informed consent. I mean, you've got patient rights documents, you've got notes from Cozier, so it seems like you've been digging into this. What are your thoughts?
Well, it seems like it's way more than just, slapping a signature on a form. It's about making sure the patient actually gets it. Like, they actually understand what they're agreeing to.
100%. Informed consent is all about, like, patient empowerment, making them an active participant in their own healthcare journey. That means making sure they understand the treatment, what the risks are, what the benefits might be, what other options are on the table, including, saying no to the treatment altogether.
So where does the nurse fit in with all of that? Because I always figured getting consent was, like, mainly the doctor's job, right?
Yeah, the doc is ultimately responsible for getting that informed consent, but nurses, you all play a critical role in the process. Think about it. You're the ones with the patient the most, right? You're in the best position to figure out if they really get what's going on.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's say a nurse feels like a patient is, I don't know, hesitant, or they don't really understand what they're signing. What should they do?
Speak up. Remember, your biggest responsibility is to the patient, always. If you have even a tiny doubt about whether the patient understands, maybe they seem pressured, unsure, it's your job to advocate for them, to say something.
Even if it means, like, delaying a procedure or something?
Even then, absolutely. Look, informed consent, it's all about protecting the patient's autonomy, their right to make choices about their own body, their own health.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like we were saying before, the nurse is the patient's advocate, and sometimes advocating means pumping the brakes, making sure everyone's really on board.
Exactly. Now, let's switch gears for a sec, talk about delegation. Your materials mention that it's really important for nurses to know what their state's Nurse Practice Act says, especially when it comes to delegating tasks, say, to a CNA. What are your initial thoughts on that?
That makes sense to me. Like, I might be the one delegating the task, but ultimately, as the nurse, I'm still the one responsible if something goes wrong.
Bingo. You're still in charge. Just because you delegate doesn't mean you get to, like, wash your hands of it. You're still responsible for making sure that task is done right, that it's done safely. And that's why those state regulations are so important. You got to know what you can delegate, who you can delegate to, and how much supervision they need.
Right. So if I tell a CNA to go take a patient's vital signs, I better make sure they actually know how to do that.
Yeah.
And it's on me to follow up, make sure those vitals aren't, completely bonkers.
Exactly. Delegation is a huge part of nursing, but it's definitely not as easy as it sounds. It takes, like, good judgment, clear communication, and keeping an eye on things.
This whole deep dive is really showing me just how much responsibility nurses carry, It's a lot to juggle. Legal stuff, ethical stuff, being the patient's advocate. Are there ever times when those things, like, clash?
Oh, absolutely. And that's when things get really, really tricky. End-of-life care, that's a big one, always brings up these kinds of challenges. You included some stuff about advance directives, DNR orders. Those are prime examples. What are your first impressions of those?
Well, they seem really important,
Yeah.
especially when a patient can't actually tell you what they want, right? But I'm honestly still a bit fuzzy on all the details. Can you, remind me what they're all about?
Think of advance directives like a roadmap for healthcare decisions. They lay out what a person wants in terms of their medical treatment if they can't speak for themselves.
So kind of like a living will.
Exactly. A living will is actually a type of advance directive. It's where someone writes down their wishes for life-sustaining treatment, like if they need to be resuscitated or put on a ventilator. And then there's also the durable power of attorney for healthcare. That's where someone appoints like a trusted person to make those decisions for them if they can't.
Okay, yeah, it's starting to come back to me. And DNR orders, those fit under this umbrella too, right?
You got it. DNR, do not resuscitate. That's a very specific type of advanced directive.
Yeah.
Basically, it's saying, hey, if my heart stops, don't try to bring me back.
And a nurse is legally and ethically obligated to honor that DNR, even if, like, family members are begging them to do otherwise.
You got it. That DNR, it's a legally binding document. No ifs, ands, or buts. Nurses, you're responsible for making sure those DNR orders are easy to find, that everyone on the healthcare team understands them, and most importantly, that everyone respects the patient's wishes no matter what.
It sounds like a lot of responsibility falls on nurses to make sure those wishes are actually carried out. Are there, like, legal protections for nurses in these situations?
Great question. And that leads us right into those Good Samaritan laws and the whole professional liability insurance thing, all those materials you gave me. But before we get into that, any other thoughts on end-of-life care or DNRs?
DNRs, they really make you think, you know?
Gotcha.
It's a heavy thing knowing you're the one making sure someone's final wishes are honored. But that's part of what nursing is, I guess.
It's so much more than just the technical stuff, that's for sure. It's about navigating those human moments with empathy, you know, with your ethical boundaries in mind. And sometimes that means knowing when to report unsafe practices. You included some stuff about that. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it seems like, I don't know, kind of a burden in a way. You have to report things like suspected abuse or if you think a colleague is impaired, obviously. But those seem more clear-cut. What about when it's not so obvious, when you're just not sure if it crosses the line? Those must be tough.
They are, no question. But you got to remember, patient safety comes first. Always. Your notes really emphasize that, especially those guidelines about reporting to the Board of Nursing. Bottom line, if you see something that puts a patient at risk or just isn't right, professionally speaking, you have to say something, even if it's hard.
Yeah. That takes courage, especially when it involves someone you work with. Your materials mention the ANA Code of Ethics as a good resource. I imagine that's really helpful in those situations. What else stands out to you about the Code of Ethics?
Think of it as your, moral compass as a nurse. It's all about integrity, about compassion, about advocating for your patients no matter what. When you're facing one of those ethical dilemmas, those tough calls, it's a lifeline.
I bet. Okay, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about those Good Samaritan laws you included. I've always wondered how those actually play out in real life.
Good Samaritan laws, they're fascinating.
Yeah.
Basically, they exist to encourage healthcare workers to help out in emergencies, even if they're off the clock. It's like a safety net, so you don't have to hesitate to help because you're worried about getting sued.
So if I'm, driving home from a shift and I see a car accident and I stop to help, I'm covered.
In most cases, yes. Every state has its own little quirks, but the main idea is that if you're acting in good faith, you're doing your best to help, you're protected. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, obviously. You still have to be reasonable. But it's there to encourage people to do the right thing.
That makes sense. It's not like you can just go around being reckless, but it's there to encourage you to, to jump in when you're needed. It's like incentivizing healthcare professionals to be everyday heroes, right?
Exactly. So last but not least, you included some info about professional liability insurance. Isn't that, usually covered by the hospital, though?
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Yeah, it often is. But having your own policy, it's something to think about. Usually the one from your employer, it only covers you for things that happen at work, while you're on the clock. Your own policy, that's like an extra layer of protection, especially if you do any volunteering or, if you end up in one of those Good Samaritan situations.
So, if I was helping out at a health fair or something and something happened, having my own policy would give me, extra peace of mind.
Exactly. It's like, you might not need it, but it's good to have, just in case.
Okay, wow. This has been, a whirlwind. We covered so much. The reasons behind all these laws, all the legal jargon, real-life examples, even those tricky ethical situations. Nurses have a lot on their shoulders.
They do. But from all this material, all these questions you've asked, it's clear you're taking this seriously, really putting in the work, understanding the legal and ethical side of nursing. It's the foundation. It's about protecting yourself, your patients, and the whole profession, really.
Absolutely. And you know what? Thinking about all this stuff with state regulations and the Nurse Practice Act, it made me wonder what happens when those laws actually clash with a nurse's own personal ethics. That's got to be a tough spot to be in.
It's one of the hardest things about nursing, no doubt. There's no easy answers. And learning how to deal with those situations, that's part of what makes this profession so challenging, but so rewarding too.
That's a really good point to end on. Knowing the rules is essential, but so is trusting your gut, that instinct to do what's right for your patients. It's a journey, this whole nursing thing, always learning, always growing.
Well said. And remember, this deep dive, it's just the beginning, you know?
Yeah.
There's a ton more to learn out there. Keep asking those tough questions.